This year's series, as I mentioned, is Unlikely Titans of Industry and Commerce, from modest beginnings to phenomenal success. And here with us today is a lecturer and a friend of mine, Paul Israel. Paul and I have known each other almost a half a century now, which makes us both feel old. We met at Hearst Castle years ago, where Paul, I think at the time, was a tour guide, and I was a security guard who came in on weekends and holidays and summers while I was in college to try to earn some extra money. Paul has written a number of books on Edison. The one you'll find at the back of the room afterward, which I'm sure Paul would be happy to sign for you, called Edison, A Life of Invention, and a couple of other books at least, and I'm sure many, many papers. Paul's in charge of the Edison Papers project at Rutgers, and I think, Paul, did you say it was 5 million pages of material?
That's the total archive.
That's the and you've been at this for a couple of decades, so there's a huge amount of material, huge amount of material to mine on Edison. So there's really no better person to talk to us about Thomas Edison, no more knowledgeable person. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Paul Israel to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. So, most of us, of course, think about Thomas Edison as the heroic inventor, right? And that's how he was depicted at the end of his life. This is from the New York Times Magazine, article written by their science editor, who talked about how Edison marked the end of the heroic age of invention, right? When inventors were like poets, right? As creative geniuses. But now the future belonged to the new industrial research laboratories that were emerging in industry. And that's the image, Edison and his so-called perfected phonograph of 1888, you know, the great inventor, the myth of his staying up 6 days to get this thing ready to go. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the slide was a little different before, but I'll keep that in mind. So this is Edison the inventor, right, in his laboratory, and Edison did a lot of chemical as well as electrical research. He also became a director of research himself. And in fact, I would argue that Edison was the first director of industrial research in the United States. And I'll talk a bit more about his laboratories. But what I'm going to focus on today is the last aspect of Edison's inventive genius, if you will, which was that Edison was an entrepreneur. What Edison understood was that there was inventive work, there was the research and development, and there was how do you get it into the marketplace? And Edison was really good at that. And so we're going to talk today about Edison as an entrepreneur, as an inventor and a director of research as well, because they're all intermingled. But I want to start with how did Edison learn entrepreneurship? So like a lot of people in the mid-19th century, Edison was born in 1847. He was born in Milan, Ohio. It was, the main thing there was a canal that allowed wheat to go from the Midwest to the Great Lakes. And then the railroads bypassed Milan, and the family moved to Port Huron, which was a lumber town in Michigan. And when he first got to Port Huron, he was actually in school for a little bit. I'll talk about that in a moment. But he was mainly taught by his mother at home, and that's how a lot of people were educated in the 19th century, if you'd had any kind of book learning, right? And Edison always credited his mother with his love of book learning and his ability to learn from books, that this was crucial to his education. So what were they reading? As it turns out, one of the things that they were reading was his father's library. His father was a free thinker, very much influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Tom Paine, Edward Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire, and so forth. Later on, Edison would actually write an introduction to a 1925 edition of Paine's works because he was so influenced by this reading he had done in his father's library under the guidance of his mother. But as I said, he did have a little bit of formal education. So when they first get to Port Huron in 1854, sometime in that first year, he is studying at the Reverend Angle's School. And this is sort of a typical private school at the time, run by the local reverend, sort of a combination of Christian and English education. We know that this is where Edison began to learn to play the piano, and he enjoyed music. He was only there for a brief period of time. The reason that is usually given why he left school was because the teacher called him addled. But we actually have a letter from the Reverend Angle to Edison talking about how he actually gave his father a break on the tuition because his father was going through a down period. And part of the problem for the family was that Sam Edison was very entrepreneurial himself, but their fortunes went up and down depending on what enterprise he was involved with. And so that's probably why they took him out of school and why his mother ended up educating him. But he did go briefly to the new public school in Port Huron. And one of the things that we know about that, besides reminiscences of other people who went with him, is that that's where he was introduced to what he called his first science book, Parker's Natural Philosophy. That's the frontispiece, and that image is a telegraph line. And the telegraph was the hot new high-tech of the mid-19th century. And Edison was fascinated by it. So this is the Reverend Angle talking about his problem paying the bills. So Sam, as I said, was an entrepreneur. We know that when they were in Milan, he made shingles. He built the home that they lived in there. He came to Port Huron. He was involved in the lumbering industry for a while. At some point, he was involved in real estate. Later on, he had a general store that he owned for a while. And in the picture on the bottom there, you'll see a big tower. So the Edison family was renting this home in Fort Gratiot, which is an area right outside of Port Huron. And Sam built that tower. He had skills as a builder and charged people to look out over the St. Clair River across the way to Canada, to Sarnia, and to see the ships. And you can just see one ship there in the upper left corner sailing through. And so another of his enterprises. He also had a truck farm. And Edison talked about working in that truck farm and even one year making $600 for the family from it. So Edison had this knowledge of being entrepreneurial that he gained from watching his father and working with him. And then he got a job as what was known as a butcher boy on the train. The Grand Trunk Railroad had just set up a line between Port Huron and Detroit. And Edison, as a butcher boy, was selling magazines and newspapers and candy to passengers on the train. And for a while, he even had a little chemical lab. You can sort of see that in the back, depicted in the back. He was learning chemistry at the time. Later on, that got taken off the train because he created a little fire, so then he had it in the family basement. But the other thing he was doing is printing a newspaper, the Weekly Herald. News along the line, and selling it to people at the various stations on the line between Port Huron and Detroit. He also was bringing produce and eggs and other things to Port Huron, and he had one young man who had a produce stand that he was operating, and another one, the extra periodicals that Edison was selling on the train, he would then sell in Port Huron at the stand. So Edison was learning to be an entrepreneur. One of the things that is going on in this period is the Civil War. So Edison is recognizing that there's a great demand for news about what's happening in the battles, and there's one particular battle where there are a lot of people from the local area. So he convinces the editor of the Detroit Free Press to give him extra newspapers. And by the time he gets to the end of the line, he'd sold out, raising the price at each stop as the number of papers went down. Edison was an entrepreneur, and from a young age. So there's the telegraph in 1846, just before Edison was born. You can see it reaching the Midwest. By the time he's in Port Huron, it is there as well. And each of the stations along the line, there was a telegraph operator helping to move the traffic. There was you didn't want accidents, and so there are trains on the same track had to know when they needed to be sighted off so the other train could pass by. And he would visit these operators to learn the business a little bit, and one operator even gave him specialized training after he saved the life of his child when a boxcar got loose. So that's Edison as a telegraph operator during the Civil War. Because so many of the regular operators were in the Union Signal Corps, the telegraph service for the Army, Edison was able to get a job anywhere he wanted. And he traveled through the Midwest, Indianapolis, and Louisville, and Cincinnati, and Memphis. And this looks like a school, and for Edison it was. That's the operating room in Cincinnati when Edison first got there in 1865. Later, when he returned in 1867, they had a better office than that one. But this was where he learned the practical aspects of telegraphy, taking care of batteries, finding faults on the line, operating, and so forth. He became what was known as a press wire operator. So the Associated Press started as a telegraph service, and operators like Edison would work overnight taking the messages. So that's Edison's writing at the top right there, the last surviving piece of copy that he wrote out for a newspaper copy. He recalled in his reminiscences writing out the story of the death of President Lincoln, the assassination, and said initially he hadn't realized that that's what he had been taking a report of, right? Because he was so busy just taking the report, the dots and dashes and the letters, not so much the story. But when he took the story down to the newspaper office in the morning, he realized what had happened, right? So this is really important. Edison, who already had some experience with the power of the press, now had even more experience of it. In fact, later on, a number of telegraph operators who would interview Edison were former telegraph operators who had become press reporters. Faraday's researches in electricity was the most advanced work in the world on electricity at this time. Edison acquired a copy, the 3 volumes, and studied it intensely. We know he went to the Cincinnati Free Library, read other works on electricity and telegraphy. So he was learning the science as well as the practical elements of telegraphy. He was also experimenting with the instruments that were in the offices. So one of the things that was very important in this period was the development of what were called automatic repeaters. With the telegraph system and the battery power, you could send a message about 250 miles, but if you wanted to send it further, you needed to bring in either a new battery to boost the signal, or somebody had to send it not automatically. And so these automatic repeaters became very important. Fellow operator and inventor, a guy named Daniel Gandy, talked about how their first effort were these repeaters, and Edison spent time. That top image is actually the patent with the instrument kind of taken apart and deployed in a different way. Edison was in the Midwest until 1868, and then he traveled to Boston, where a good friend had gotten him a job in the Maine Western Union office there. And Boston was very important because Boston was one of the headquarters of the telegraph manufacturing industry. It had sprung up there because that's where there were a number of colleges in the Boston area, just as there are today, and scientific instrument makers had been amongst the first to manufacture telegraph equipment after Morse's inventive work. So in the 1840s and 50s, it was the scientific instrument makers that turned into telegraph manufacturers. Charles Williams Jr. was a very important manufacturer. He was one of several shops that Edison visited when he first got to Boston to understand what was going on at the time in these various shops. And so there's an article kind of hidden by that first person there, which is an article about the manufacturers in Boston, written by Thomas Edison. And he described the experimental work that was going on by people like Moses Farmer. Who has anybody ever heard of him? I'm not surprised, but you know about the fire alarm telegraph. You pull it down, it sends the signal. Co-inventor of that, 1854. He was one of the leading electrical inventors of the mid-19th century. The other fellow might ring a bell, a guy named Thomas Watson. So Bell's assistant was a machinist at Williams' shop. Why a machinist? Bell was working on what was really a form of telegraphy known as acoustic telegraphy, so he would send multiple signals using different tones sent by tuning forks or vibrating reeds. He walks into Williams' shop and hooks up with Watson, who then becomes not just the machinist that's helping to make these things, but also his assistant. And for a while, they actually experimented in the attic of Williams' shop. So, being an inventor-manufacturer is Edison's next stop on his path. He begins by getting space in Williams' shop for his own work and having his instruments made there. The vote recorder turns out not to be a successful instrument. He thought Congress or the local legislatures might be interested, but they were more interested in wheeling and dealing before any vote. They didn't want to speed things up. So that was a lesson that he learned. The bottom instrument doesn't look like it. Right at this point is when you begin to get these small printing telegraphs used as stock printers or reporting from various exchanges, the gold exchange. This one Edison used for the gold exchange in Boston. Okay? And he also was working on what was known as a double transmitter. The most expensive part of a telegraph system are the wires, both the cost of the wires and then the cost of stringing them across the country, right? So, Edison thought if he could find a way to send more than one signal at a time, it would be very important. And he was not the only one working on this problem. A guy named Joseph Stearns, who I'll mention in a little bit, is a guy who was also working in Boston at this time on that. And Edison even compares his work to Stearns. So he goes down to Boston, from Boston to New York, and puts it on a line to Rochester. And it is not working properly. So he needs to take it into the shops to get it modified. But he's not in the shop in the same way that he was at Williams' shop, so he has to wait in line, right? Very important thing he learns, waiting the alteration of my instruments on account of the piling up of jobs at the instrument makers. So there's the first stock ticker, a guy named Edward Callahan invented it. Has anybody ever heard of Callahan? You ever heard of ADT? So ADT is American District Telegraph. The other thing that Callahan invented was something called the district telegraph, where you'd pull a lever and it would send a signal for a police or burglar or a taxi or a doctor or a messenger. Edison also worked on that, again, following in Callahan's footsteps. So Callahan nobody knows about, Edison you do. But the company, Golden Stock Telegraph Company, that was set up to promote his system of sending exchange information. This guy, Marshall Lefferts, was the president of the company, and his goal was to try to dominate the field by controlling the technology, the inventors, and the patents, right? An important lesson for Edison as he became a successful inventor. So the Golden Stock Telegraph executives actually make these agreements with Edison. So one is for his one-wire stock printer, again, reducing the number of wires, right? There were 2 and 3, sometimes 4 wires used in these printers at this time, so they could do everything they needed to do. And he also became a consultant to Golden Stock. The other agreement was the more important one, ultimately, is for an instrument that he never developed successfully, an autographic telegraph, so he could write something out or draw something and it could be transmitted. The earliest form of facsimile, right? So that's what it was called, a facsimile telegraph, right? So this is how fax technology started. So in this one, Edison gets rent for a room, tools and machinery, and hiring a machinist. And then he turns it into the Newark Telegraph Works, his first shop. And at the very same time that that's going on, he gets hooked up with another company called the Automatic Telegraph Company, a guy named Daniel Craig, former president of the Associated Press, was promoting a system to send press wire messages much more quickly using automatic machinery. Punched tape, as that tape went between 2 rollers, it would create a contact, the signal would go out over the line, and at the other end, the message would be reproduced as dots and dashes. In this case, ink recording, or not ink recording, excuse me, chemical recording, chemically treated paper, and the metal stylus would discolor the paper as the electric charge went through. So the Automatic Telegraph Company, the president of that company, agreed to fund the American Telegraph Works, Edison's second shop in Newark, right? So that by October, he could write to his parents, right? I have one shop which employs 18 men and fitting up another which will employ 150 men. I'm now what you Democrats call a bloated Eastern manufacturer. And this is a map that appears in volume 1 of the papers of Thomas A. Edison. And you can get a sense of how active he was in Newark. So there are 3 different homes, which we won't go into detail, but the Ward Street shop, that star in the center, became the main shop that Edison had from 1871 to 1875, 4-story. You'll see a picture of it in a minute. But he had other shops. So the Newark Telegraph Works, the American Telegraph Works. He had a small experimental shop. He had another partner for a brief period of time who then becomes his main partner in some other shops. Edison was a busy guy, to say the least. So that was 1870. By 1871, his reputation is such that the president of Western Union had heard about him. This guy he didn't know how to spell his name, but he knew who he was, right? And that he was working on a one-wire transmitter for Golden Stock. And Phelps, who was the head of the Western Union shops and one of the key people in the development of printing telegraphy, is compared to Edison, or I should say Edison is compared to him very favorably, right? Second only to Phelps. In May of 1871, Edison signs a new agreement with Golden Stock, $2,000 a year, substantial sum of money in that time to be consulting electrician. They buy all of his patent rights. They buy his rights to that new instrument on the right there, his universal stock ticker, which becomes the primary printer used at the stock exchange and in some other exchanges as well. Western Union acquired Golden Stock because they were transmitting commercial news, and they didn't want a competitor, essentially, is what was going on. So this is the Ward Street shop, 4 stories. Those are the workmen when it was called Edison and Unger, later Edison and Murray, the other partner. The universal stock printer, which was the market reporting instrument, and then the private line printer. And you'll see a keyboard. So you didn't have to be a skilled operator to use it. So you could have a printer in your factory and another in your shop and communicate between them, for example. This is one of the ways those were used. So Edison was a manufacturer. He even developed the instrument with interchangeable parts, right? So he was manufacturing these for golden stock and manufacturing the parts for repair purpose out of the offices of the local newspaper where he was getting news from and then transmitting it. The young lady there is one of the women who was transmitting the news service. She is Mary Stillwell, later Edison. They marry on Christmas Day, 1971. So a research laboratory. Why did Edison go to a research laboratory? He had these shops. He was making money as an inventor manufacturer. Shop invention was the way things were done, right? All of the technologies of the period, even these printing telegraphs, are all mechanical, even if they're driven by electricity, right? And so prototyping, being able to try a variety of different ways of doing something was really important to an inventor like Edison. And that shop with its skilled machinists allowed him to do that. But Edison soon discovered that he needed more than just the mechanical side of the telegraph. He goes to Britain to try to introduce his automatic telegraph. The investors in the company send him there. He tries it on a line between between London and Liverpool. The problem is, once the lines go into the city, they go underground. And that creates a kind of delay of the signal. A thing called induction causes this. And he wasn't getting very good results. He even tries it on a coiled submarine cable, because London, the British led the world in submarine telegraphy. That worked even worse on the submarine cables. And William Preece, who was the head of the British Post Office Telegraph, who a few years later came to, so this is 1873 and 1877, he comes to the US to investigate the US system and describes the difference, right? In Britain, the abstruse laws of electricity needed to be studied because of this induction problem. That wasn't true in the US, where everything was above ground. You didn't have that kind of, lightning was the biggest problem in the US system, right? And that's how they knew how to adjust the instruments to overcome those problems. So the English telegraph engineer had become a scientific man, as Preece says. And Edison talks to these engineers, both for the postal system and for the submarine cables, and realizes, I don't know enough. He even says that to one of the engineers who reported later that Edison said he was going to go home and figure all this stuff out. He visited the telegraph shops in London. He's finding electrical testing instruments. Lord Kelvin, Sir William Thomson, the leading physicist of the day, who was crucial in the development of the submarine telegraph, developed a bunch of these, including the galvanometer that Edison is using in the upper right there. He orders a whole bunch of equipment from Britain, so that by December, he goes in April, May, returns in June. By December, he could tell a fellow inventor, yeah, bring your sun recorder over to my lab. I have every conceivable variety of electric apparatus and any quantity of chemicals for experimentation. So now Edison had a shop, but he also had a little lab in it, right? So this is crucial. And he's doing what we would call basic applied research. He's not trying so much to understand the underlying scientific characteristic of what's going on, but to understand how to design instruments based on scientific principles. And so the design of the core of the electromagnet is one of the things that he investigates. He experiments long magnets with short magnets. The short magnet becomes very crucial for a thing called the quadruplex. As you might guess, unlike a duplex, it sends 4 messages, quad, 2 in each direction. So there's the Stearns duplex that was adopted in 1871 by Western Union. Edison designs his quadruplex. He goes into William Orton's office and says, I can design these by the bushelful. And Orton, becoming concerned that others can do the same thing and evade Stearns Patents, agrees to let Edison patent as many variations as he can. Why? To control the technology, right? Control the patents. The Panic of 1873, though, has a big influence on what happens. So after the Civil War, there's a huge railway boom. And J. Cook and Company are one of the investment bankers that are supplying funds, and they go bust. And by the fall of 1874, it's a huge problem. I mean, these are like depressions, right? And this is really affected Edison's shop. He's in danger of losing it. He gets a loan from the investors, Harrington and some of the investors in the automatic telegraph company. Harrington's the president of the company. And then he meets with Gould, who says, I'll take these patents off your hand. He buys out the automatic telegraph company, and then he buys the quadruplex, Edison's rights to the quadruplex. The reason he was able to do that, Edison wasn't working on a formal contract with Western Union, and every time he urged Orton to pay him because he needed the money, Orton wasn't around. He was busy with other stuff. He was on a trip to Chicago, and Edison needed the money, so he sold out to Gould. Gould planned to use the quadruplex and the automatic on his Atlantic and Pacific telegraph system built around his Atlantic and Pacific railroad system. Edison knew the telegraph industry, and we see him advising in these documents Gould about being involved in the telegraph industry. He talks about how we could set up night letters, right, using his automatic system. Most people didn't send telegraphs. It was too expensive. They were still writing letters. But if you could send inexpensive night letters using the automatic, hey, maybe we can get more traffic for the Atlantic and Pacific. He talks about a little pamphlet that Gould ought to have the company put out. So Edison is very much not intimidated by these titans of finance. So he uses that money from Gould to set up a real laboratory now. He takes 2 floors of the Ward Street shop. He and his primary assistant, Charles Batchelor, draw up a long list of things they're going to work on, and one of those is a copying system that becomes known as the Edison electric pen. Little electric motor drives a needle. As you write with it, you create a stencil, and you squeegee ink through it. Later on, a guy named A.B. Dick would acquire rights to the Edison electric pen and to some other patents that Edison had related to it, and begin to manufacture what was then called the Edison mimeograph. And then later on, it became the A.B. Dick mimeograph. But Newark was a major manufacturing center. The leather industry was very big there. Leather is a very dirty, smelly, polluting industry, and Edison wanted to get his family to a nicer environment. So he found failed housing development in central New Jersey, and his father came out and built this laboratory at the top there, 2 stories, 25 by 100, which Edison filled with machinery and apparatus that altogether cost him about $40,000. That's somewhere around $900,000, $950,000 if we were to convert it in today's dollars. It's a lot of money. I mean, Edison is pretty well off as an inventor, right? He's got the machine shop, he's got the scientific laboratory on the first floor, the second floor, the machine shop on the first floor. And he's very successful early on in this new laboratory. In 1876, at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, a guy named Alexander Graham Bell shows his telephone. And Edison is working on this for Western Union. And Edison actually invents a much better transmitter. In fact, the standard transmitter until we went digital was a form of the Edison transmitter invented in 1877. While working on the telephone, Edison thinks about recording telephone messages because he was a telegraph inventor and he thought about recording messages. This becomes an independent instrument known as the phonograph. And that's how Edison becomes the Wizard of Menlo Park. It's not the electric light, it's the phonograph, right? It so astounds people that reporters start coming from New York and Boston and Philadelphia to see this guy and this invention, right? And that's what makes Edison's reputation. But what confirms the reputation is that he creates an entire new industry. And this is really Edison taking everything he had learned to that point and really taking on the project, not just of inventing a lamp, but an entire industry. So in 1878, Edison is thinking about incandescent lighting because arc lights were beginning to appear. These are very brilliant street lights. An arc light is just two carbon rods held apart from each other. A current goes through them, and it creates a big spark that creates a very bright light. Great for street lighting, not so good for indoors. So he thinks about the existing lighting system in places like New York. Gas light. Central station, the gas transmitted through tubes underground. Gas lamps turned on and off individually. Very pleasant looking fixtures. He thought about how he could even convert those fixtures into gas pipes to take up his electrical system. A meter in order to be able to charge, and the cost had to be no more and preferably cheaper than gas. So in September, he gives this interview. By October, people connected to Western Union and Golden Stalk Telegraph Company, investors like the Drexel Morgan and partners in the Drexel Morgan Bank, were investing in this new company, Edison Electric Light. And what they were investing in was Edison's research on this system. Between October of 1878 and March of 1881, it was about $130,000 that they spent on the research and development. This is nearly $4 million, right? This is the laboratory as it existed in by 1880. What happened there? There we go. So there's the main lab building. It's wood. In the front there is a new brick office and library. And in the back is a brick machine shop. And there are some other ancillary buildings as well. New scientific staff. 2 PhD chemists trained in Germany, which is where he went for PhD in chemistry. Oops, there we go again. Francis Upton, the first ever Masters of Science student at Princeton. He also hired a scientific glass blower because he soon discovered he needed vacuum lamps for his new lamp. And so the first year, basic applied research to develop a lamp and a generator. He actually had the generator before he had the lamp. But as you can see, he's not just working on a lamp, he's working on a system. They exhibited over New Year's. In fact, extra trains are put on from New York and Philadelphia because people want to come out and see this, right? They put street lights out, all the buildings are lit up with a light that doesn't flicker, right? Steady white light of the incandescent lamp. And then Edison turns from research to development. So each part of the system has to be developed. The lamps, the screw socket is invented, fixtures are designed, a meter is designed, the safety fuse. Most of you look like you're old enough to remember when you used the old safety fuse that you had to screw in and out. Today it's the trip switch. That was invented at Menlo Park as part of the system, the underground conductors, the network, and of course the generator. Edison expanded his staff, more researchers, more machinists. He built a lamp factory. He actually took the old electric pen manufacturing building and turned it into a lamp factory because they had to figure out how to manufacture this new item, an incandescent lamp. And he had one of his office staff keep a daily record of what went on in the laboratory and the construction and installation of equipment in the factory. They built a model system at Menlo Park because the idea was that they were going to go into New York. In lower Manhattan, just to the left of east, you'll see what looks like a little network of lines there. That's where the Pearl Street station was going. But before they went, Edison did his market research. How much light are you using? He sent men out to take a survey, a census of the light use. When was it used? How much were you using? He also thought about the fact that he was going to have this very expensive station, and most people used light at night because it was too expensive to use during the day. So mostly it was windows with natural light, right, that people were using only on dark days. Would you have the lights on? Oops. Sorry, wrong way. There we are. So he thought about selling power. He designs an electric railway as one possible use for that. Motors for things like sewing machines and other equipment. They bring out the aldermen. They wine and dine them from Delmonico's because they have to tear up the city streets to put the underground conductors. And why underground conductors? Edison knew about the telegraph system and the fact that by 1876, cities were beginning to say, hey, there's too many wires here. And then you have the telephone, and then you have these arc lights. And all of a sudden, the city streets are just shaded by all of these wires. So he knew he needed to go underground. He gets the fire insurance underwriters to approve his system. It'll be safer than gas. And he convinces J.P. Morgan and his banking partners to establish the Edison Electric Light Company and the Tube Company for manufacturing those conductors and installing the Pearl Street Station, which cost a little over $300,000, which was about $9 million. But they wouldn't fund the manufacturing, right? So the manufacturing was crucial, as Edison understood. So he sets up the machine works for the heavy equipment, Bergman and Company for the fixtures and meters and things like that, the tube works, and they moved the lamp factory to what was then known as East Newark or Harrison, New Jersey, right across the river from Newark, and continued to do experimental work to improve the lamp. So by the time they're really getting competition in the mid-1880s, they felt that they were well ahead of everybody else. In fact, that's how Edison thought about his patenting, right? 8 or 9 things that'll protect the system. Didn't really, because the patent system is much more complicated than that. But the patents I'm now taking are more valuable than those already taken. Those 9 or 10 were to secure, if possible, the science of the thing. That is the fundamental patents. Those I'm now taking are commercial. Right? And in 81, 82, and 83, he took out many more patents than he did while he was at Menlo Park, because they were trying to make the system work, right? This is the innovation part. It's about figuring out the marketing and then making it work in the real world. And Edison was really good at that. In the meantime, that Pearl Street Station was so expensive, nobody was beating a path to their door. Instead, they set up another company, the Isolated Company, for plants for individual buildings. So this building, for example, could have its own incandescent lighting system, right? And they were being used for all sorts of commercial and private buildings and ships. So Edison redesigned the system to be less expensive, smaller generators, a more efficient distribution system that could go over a larger area. He even began to put up overhead lines, booming the business with some of his associates. Right? Again, these village systems. Edison felt there was a lot of money here. I'm going to get a big syndicate. He never did. It was all his own money once again, right? He was trying to show the company you can be successful installing central stations. So Edison was the entrepreneur, again, with the central station system. These are the systems that he built. You can see there's some underground lines to use, but a lot of them are Ps. They're a lot less expensive than Pearl Street. And then he reorganizes the Edison Electric Light Company so they take over his business, installing central stations. He wants a board with less law and more business. He puts his own people in charge. And the central station business begins to take off. There's another reason that he wanted to have the company take it over. His wife died in 1884 in the summer. So by October, he was ready to give up the business part of things. A year later, he meets this young woman, Mina Miller. Her father was co-founder of Chautauqua Institution. He was a manufacturer of agricultural equipment and an inventor himself. They get married in February of 1886. That's from the only private diary Edison ever kept, where he was talking about Mina. They buy a home in Llewellyn Park in West Orange, New Jersey, and Edison sets up a new laboratory, much bigger. There are 4 small outbuildings, each 25 by 100, original dimensions of the Menlo Park. It's a 3-story main building. There are 2 machine shops. There's a library. There's a chemistry lab. There's an electrical lab. The staff is around 150 men, twice as big as Menlo Park. He planned to have the best equipped and largest laboratory facilities incomparable to any others. Development invention, working it up into commercial shape, right? With models, patterns, special machinery. That is the manufacturing part of it. There would be no institution like it. He had a long list of things he was going to work on, but he needed the money because it cost him a lot to build that and equip it and hire men. And to pay the weekly payroll, most of the research ended up being electricity. Because he was getting a lot of competition, especially from Westinghouse, who had drawn together a number of very important inventors to develop the Westinghouse high voltage alternating current system. AC enabled new markets, right? You could transmit a longer distance. It meant if you were in the suburb, you didn't need to install a central station plant in the suburbs. You could install it further away and then bring the lines in. So there's a book, it's a little controversial, but I think it works well for the electric light and Edison, Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. He talks about startup firms envisioning different markets, more entrepreneurial, leading them to value disruptive technology. That's what Westinghouse was doing. Initially, it wasn't as profitable as what Edison was doing. And Edison said, yeah, they're not as profitable as us. And then, like many established firms, we're going to focus on cost. So prices can be cut down. That's how we're going to compete, right? We don't need to go to AC. We're going to compete on cost. They set up this new company, Edison General Electric. Henry Villard, another railroad investor, is involved in that. Edison also argues for the dangers of high voltage. Those arc light systems sometimes cause linemen on the telegraph and telephone lines to be electrocuted. And Edison thought that Westinghouse was going to kill somebody at some point because of the high voltage. He even had communication with the head of a committee that the New York State had set up for alternative to hanging for capital punishment. Edison opposed capital punishment, but eventually agreed to conduct experiments because if it was going to be done, it should be done humanely. He writes an article about the dangers of electric lighting. There's also experiments on dogs, because the SPCA, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, is interested in finding a humane method of putting unwanted animals to death. This leads to the electric chair. Edison didn't invent it, but it did lead to that. So there's this way in which, right, the competition over AC and DC leads to this horrific new method of executing people. It's a problem we're still trying to solve, as with the recent use of nitrous gas. Samuel Insull, Edison's former business manager, he's running Edison General Electric. He says, we need AC. You promised the Edison Electric illuminating companies that you were going to develop an AC system. Edison never did that. both Edison General Electric and Thomson House, another AC company that started as an arc light company, are overcapitalized compared to Westinghouse. And what ends up happening is that they are merged by the bankers. So the bankers for Westinghouse and, for Thomson House, and the bankers for Edison, J.P. Morgan, get together and decide, let's bring these companies together. The newspaper accounts are conflicting as to how Edison felt, but he said, I can no longer waste my time over electric lighting. And in fact, he turns to other projects. So he begins innovating new industries. His Ogden mine and ore milling plant, he spent 10 years, $2.2 million, about 84 million today, altogether about 2.5 million, 95 million, to find a way to process low-grade iron ore for the eastern mines. The problem is that the new Mesabi range in the Midwest suddenly had low-cost ore that Edison couldn't compete with by 1897, and he tried for another couple of years, but eventually had to shut down his mine. It was a very expensive operation. But Edison figured out how to take the technology he developed, especially the rock crushing technology, which was producing this amazing sand for Portland cement, and transfer that to this other industry. And he also began to sell his crushing rolls to other mines. This is Edison's long 150 rotary kiln, 150-foot rotary kiln, revolutionized the cement industry, the Portland cement industry. Edison built a huge plant in western New Jersey at Stewartsville. Amongst the structures put up with the cement was the original Yankee Stadium and all sorts of other buildings. He developed the sound recording industry. In 1888, at his new laboratory, he developed his so-called perfected phonograph. It was run by electric motors, batteries. The initial idea was it would be a dictating machine, but the companies using it for dictating weren't making any money, so they started to use it as an entertainment device. And Edison soon realized, this is the future. We need to convince people that this is the future, right? Sound recording for entertainment purposes. And they begin to manufacture records. Edison develops this gold mold process for molding these cylinder records. They begin recording artists. The industry grows very rapidly in the late 1890s. He continues to produce some electric machines, but mostly they are powered by a little wind-up motor. And another company emerges, Victor. So in the circle there's a little dog listening to a phonograph, his master's voice. That actually was originally a cylinder phonograph, and it was offered to Edison. But Edison only advertised Edison, right? This is a really important issue. This is a consumer market, and Edison didn't understand that as the industry matured, it was harder to market just the technology, right? So when he does go to a disc phonograph and also tries to compete on a cylinder with his Amberola as a competition with the Victrola, the artists are not the ones that people want. So there's this wonderful letter that's sent when Edison's doing the survey. The only way to enjoy an Edison is to purchase a Victor attachment and buy Victor records. For some confounded or conservative reason, you people have filled up your catalog with a lot of recreations of music as old as the hills. Under 3 or 4 different headings, your records are entirely too high priced. The Victor people have got the artists is a common expression. Edison has the tone, of course. You really haven't much of a selection of songs to choose from. Many of your artists are scarcely known. Edison was the fellow choosing the music and the artists. He wanted people who he thought sounded best when they recorded, that were not necessarily known for their performances. And so Victor's advertising Caruso and Edison is advertising Edison. Motion pictures. Edison is the first to commercialize motion pictures. Again, it's a little nickel and slot device, little peephole mechanism. He even thinks about combining it with a phonograph, never does so successfully. But it doesn't it isn't much more than a novelty. And Edison, in fact, seems to think that it doesn't have much commercial value when he develops it. But then people begin to develop projectors. So Edison introduces his vitascope. He just buys somebody else's patents and markets it as his own. But as you can see, even as that's happening, he never really understands the consumer industry. All of Edison's really great successes were not for consumers directly. And the two industries where he was most involved in consumer industry, these entertainment technologies of phonographs and motion pictures, as they mature and the art form becomes more important, Edison falls by the wayside and both his companies ultimately fail. He tries to control the industry through the Motion Picture Patents Company, controlling the patents again, but the antitrust suit against him by the government puts the kibosh on that. Instead, you get the artists, right, who are the ones who are successful. He is very successful, as I say, with producer technologies like batteries. So his battery that he developed for the phonograph in 1888-89 is one of his most successful inventions. And it's used all over for industrial purposes. He even sets up a huge manufacturing plant. It begins as two small buildings, and by the turn of the century, it's that big complex on the right there. It's very near, on the rail line, very near his West Orange lab. He develops a battery for electric automobiles, the first alkaline battery, storage battery. The problem is, two things happen. Henry Ford, who you'll soon hear about, next week, I guess, figures out how to make very inexpensive gas automobiles. So that drives down the cost of ownership. And then World War I happens, and you can't use electric automobiles out on the battlefield. So that kind of puts the kibosh on the electric automobiles, but the Edison battery is used extensively. Into the 1960s, that battery plant was still in operation. So how do we think about Edison's legacy of entrepreneurial innovation? He used his laboratories to develop new products, right? His ambition, as he said, was to build a great industrial works in the Orange Valley, with the laboratory perfecting the invention models, patterns, fitting up the special machinery in the factories. And so phonographs, talking doll didn't succeed. Phonograph records, electric appliances, batteries, motion picture equipment. This is in 1903, this image of the lab and the factories. By 1920, he had combined all of his companies together in Thomas A. Edison Incorporated. A disastrous fire in 1914 allowed him to actually rebuild all the plants into modern concrete structures. Still producing the batteries, the disc phonograph now, his dictating machine, the Ediphone, which was a cylinder but very successful. They had the Edison Portland cement plant still producing. So Edison was very successful, ultimately, as an inventor and a manufacturer. And he was that because he was an innovator, right? Combining invention, research and development, and innovation, entrepreneurship, to create three industries: electric, light, and power, sound recording, motion pictures. He was involved in telecommunications, telegraph and telephone, batteries, as we saw. He was involved in the chemical industry for a lot of the work that he was doing, cement manufacture, the mining project that ultimately failed as well. And ultimately, the corporate research and development laboratory. Edison created a new model that was used by other companies. So I will end with that and be happy to take your questions. Yeah.
Looking back on his life, was he more interested just in creating ideas rather than wealth?
Yes, absolutely. So this is the thing about Edison. When he died, he left an estate. Well, so first of all, the homes had gone to the wife. There was the laboratory that went to the two sons from the second marriage. And then he left an estate of $12 million. That's not a lot of money in 1931 compared to all the other entrepreneurs that you're going to talk about, or the tycoons that you're going to be talking about in this series. Because Edison kept investing in the next innovation. You saw that with the ore milling. That was true of other projects. After the electric light, he increasingly said, I don't want the bankers involved, right? I'm going to do it myself. And so he kept, right, investing in his own inventive activity, his own research and development, and then was the one taking it into the marketplace. Yeah, he had some investors occasionally in those projects, but more and more it was his own money.
So the only time he liquidated was with Gould.
I'm sorry, was with
Gould.
Well, he doesn't really liquidate, right? He still has his shop. What happens is he's in danger of having to liquidate. But Gould says, I'll buy your patents from you for a lot of money. And Edison takes that money and invests it in the laboratory, right? And so he can give up, he actually has enough money, he can give up the manufacturing part and leave it to his partner and just focus on the inventive part for a period. Yeah. Yeah, somebody back there, it looks like.
And further asking, was his companies totally private or were they publicly traded?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Were his companies privately owned or were they publicly traded?
Yeah, no, they were all privately owned. And the last company, Thomas A. Edison, Inc., was privately owned. His son, Charles, who also served a term as governor of New Jersey, took over the company, and in the late 60s, they sold it to a company that became known as McGraw-Edison. And that's when the Edison company, or the private company, disappeared. Yeah. Oh, I think there's somebody back there. There's somebody up here after you're through there. So.
What was the relationship of Henry Flagler and Edison?
So that's a good question. John may be able to answer that question better than I can.
The only relationship I'm aware of is that, of course, being a fellow Floridian of sorts, Edison spending time on the west coast of Florida with Firestone and Ford, he knew about the Overseas Railroad and wrote a letter petitioning Flagler to use his Portland concrete. Flagler politely replied that he'd be happy to test it along with the hundreds of other formulas he was testing. Didn't end up using Edison Portland concrete after all.
Yeah. I think somebody right here had a Heather.
Can you shed some light on his relationship with Western Union and when that ended?
Yeah.
And I'm curious because I'll share something with all of you. When I was a child, I used to watch my father send stories to the New York Times via the Western Union telegrapher in the press box.
They were probably using teletype at that time?
No teletype.
No
Western .. In fact, he would send a story sometimes if he was covering a yachting story. He would throw it in a bottle to have people catch it, to take it to the Western Union office to publish it and to make the deadline.
Okay.
And so I was curious when this all ended.
Yeah. So I also have a little addendum to your story, but I'll start with the Edison part of it. So Edison became a Western Union operator in 1863-64. We don't know exactly when he started working for Western Union. There were other companies at the time as well. And he worked briefly for the Grand Trunk as an operator. But by 1864, he was a Western Union operator. He was a Western Union operator when he went to Boston in 1868. In January of 1869, he resigned his position as operator to become a full-time inventor. Then he gets involved with the Golden Stock Telegraph Company, and through them, Western Union. Edison is under contract with Western Union. He signs a new contract in 1877. That's when he's working on the telephone technology for Western Union. And then Western Union in 1879 William Morton dies, and the new president, a guy named Norman Green, decides that Western Union's business is telegraphy, not telephony. And the telephone is just a local telegraph system, just like the market reports and other things. And he sells out to the Bell Company. And he sells Edison's contract to Bell. So Edison actually works for the Bell Company, actually does some more experimental work in the mid-1880s for the Bell Company. That sort of ends his formal time with Western Union. I think Orton's death makes a big difference. Now, you talked about sending sports stories. Ronald Reagan, I don't know if you remember the stories he used to tell about being a Cubs operator and reading the story off the ticker and recreating it. You know which ticker that was? They were using the Edison Universal Stock ticker for reporting scores, for gambling purposes, and for other things, horse racing. So the Telegraph for a long time played a real role in the sports reporting of various kinds.
We have a question from online. How did the public view Edison in his day?
So, that's a very good question. Edison was seen as the greatest American inventor of all. When he becomes famous in 1878 and goes down to Washington to exhibit his inventions to his telephone and phonograph to Congress, the National Academy of Sciences, and the president, one of the New York papers talks about how Edison represents the greatness of America, right? In the 18th century, we taught the world a new politics, and now we're going to lead them in terms of improving the condition of humanity through the patent system. And when he goes to Paris in 1889, where he is followed everywhere he goes, there's a universal exposition, his is the largest of all the exhibits. A similar report appears in the New York newspapers. When he dies, he is the headline news all over the world. There are cards and letters sent from royalty, from heads of state, from common people, mourning the loss of this great inventor, right? The headlines in the newspapers are about Edison and what he had done. So during his day, he was seen as this person who helped invent the modern world, essentially. We're a little bit more critical of him these days.
Final question, I promise. When he consolidated all 10 companies towards the end of his career, was that for ease of transfer from one company to another or for estate planning purposes?
No, neither. So, one of the things that happens in the first couple of decades of the 20th century is the creation of multi-divisional companies, right? Edison is following a trend, and he does this on the advice of his lawyer. He says you can better manage your companies if they're divisions of a single company instead of independent companies. And that's why he does it. Not for tax purposes, not for estate planning, but because that was the trend in American business at that time. Yep, there's a question.
Yeah, is there a question over here?
Yeah, right here.
Thank you for taking my question. So did he have any role in military operations during this period, and would you say something about that?
Yeah, so I didn't include that. As you saw, it was a long enough talk to begin with. Edison is a hard person to fit down into a single talk. So in World War I, Edison was involved in something called the Naval Consulting Board. The idea for this actually arose from one of Edison's chief assistants at this time, the guy who was kind of running the lab for him, a guy named Hutchison. It was a plan initially to try to sell the Edison storage battery to the Navy for submarines. And as Germany is threatening increasingly with its U-boats, there's great concern over a world war or a European war that might involve the U.S. So they plant an article in the New York Times where Edison gives an interview about the need for defense research. And the Secretary of the Navy picks up on this and decides, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's form a naval consulting board. The idea of the board is that you'll bring together all these inventors and leaders of industrial research, and they will look at all these great inventions that the ordinary American is going to send in, and there were hundreds of inventions that were sent to the Naval Consulting Board, to pick out those things that we can use. And then members of the board, Edison and other prominent inventors of the time, actually did their own research as well. Edison did a lot of research for the Navy during World War I, between 1917 and 1919, worked on a whole range of things. The Navy was a fairly conservative force when it came to introducing new technology, and so the naval engineers weren't terribly interested in any of the things that the Naval Consulting Board were doing, and Edison wasn't the only inventor who complained about them. A guy named Reginald Fessenden, who had worked in Edison's West Orange laboratory and was very involved in the development of radio technology, especially FM frequency radio, he also complained, was a member of this, complained the Navy was completely ignoring everything. He writes to Edison about how they're completely ignoring what we're doing. So that's Edison's experience in terms of doing research. He did it as defensive research rather than offensive research.
So this is sort of a societal personality question. What do we know about his management style? Was he difficult to talk to? Was he persuadable? What was everybody was very competitive then. What do we know of that side of life?
So I think Edison was very sure of his own opinions. He could, early in his career, it was easier, I think, to convince him to take a different course or to think differently about things, but he was pretty stubborn. We saw with the AC/DC debate that Edison wasn't willing to change his views sufficiently to meet the new challenge. We know that his son, Charles, took over the company during World War I, established all these this is the era where you begin to get these new social services for employees. Edison kind of tosses a number of them out the window when he comes back and takes things over again. Edison grew up in an era of sole entrepreneurial ownership and didn't make the transition to corporate management very well. And I think this is one of his real faults. And that is actually not just an historical case, but that is a common issue. Even today, entrepreneurs build up a business and they're very resistant to changing the direction the company is taking, especially as the company matures and the industry matures. And I think that's part of Edison's lesson, is that you need to be able to give up more control, right, under those conditions. And Edison was not so good at that.
Well, thank you all for being here. I hope that you will join us next week. I'm going to advance the slide here. There we go. Join us with Dr. Stephen Watts to talk about Henry Ford. Thanks again to our sponsor, Related, and thanks to all of you for being here. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Go Niners.